of features I want to mention. Kind of hard to see on this version, but I'll present the map. I'll flip it in a minute. For a start, it doesn't really come out on this image too well, but the Red Sea is actually presented in a different colour from the other seas. The Red Sea actually has a slight red shade on the original version of it. So the Red Sea actually appears in red. The oceans appear in a kind of greeny colour usually, and the rivers appear in, oh actually no, I'm talking about the one. But yes, so Mecca appears at the centre. Mecca, there's basically in a minute. Apologies. Now the map is based on a high level of mathematical accuracy. It is actually in many ways a very accurate map, considering the science available at the time. So it's a scientific map, but it's clearly also quite artistic. It's clearly reflective of a certain vision. The fact that, as I say, Mecca is given priority, and it really shows sort of the interconnectedness of the Islamic world. What we see is that by al-Idrisi, he was trying to convey the Islamic world as one, as the Ummah of Islam. So everything is kind of consistent and interconnected. But historically, this is quite different from what was going on. This is a time when actually much of the world was quite divided. The Abbasid Caliphate, for example, was very fractured at the time he made this map. So what he's trying to do is say, well, the Islamic world is more connected and more consistent than is really the case. So that a viewer would look at it and think, Mecca is most important, it appears in the centre very clearly, the Islamic world is all one. What's also interesting is, unlike many other maps of the time, is it shows the lands of people of other religion, so non-Muslim lands, also appear, showing this multi-faith viewpoint. As I'll show with other maps later on, you get some Christian maps, for example, and they'll only really show Christian features and they'll kind of ignore everyone else. This map is interesting because although it prioritizes Islam, it doesn't ignore other faiths. It shows actually really quite a holistic view of the world. Islam is number one, but other religions matter as well to this viewpoint. So I think a very interesting map in that respect. So if I had to flip it, and just, this is kind of this is actually what the original, or kind of one version of it looks like flipped. It appears maybe a bit more easily, certainly for an English speaker. Mecca is kind of labelled there. Really is right in the centre of it, and although it gets certain aspects a little bit different from reality, like these kind of huge territory south of the Arabian Peninsula in India, doesn't mean an Indian Ocean on it. Actually, other features do appear quite clearly. You can see Europe appears quite well. I think like India appears reasonably well as well. So it's one way of looking at the world. So I mentioned religion. This is a different version or different form. This is a famous map called the Mappa Mundi, and this is a map which is quite well known in England, certainly, I'd say. And it is the world as viewed by medieval Christian Europe. This is a kind of Christian perspective of the world from 1300. Now, a few other kind of key features of it. What we see is it's a kind of visual encyclopedia, like al-Idrisi's map. It hardly attempts to be scientifically accurate, but it also appears to be quite creative and artistic. It appears to show different features which talk through the story of the Bible. So different biblical themes appear. And in this case, what appears at the top, not Mecca, but the Garden of Eden. So, with the Garden of Eden in the Christian Bible, this is what is given priority. And again, this means that north isn't at the top of it. I think we're used to seeing north at the top of our maps. Okay? But al-Idrisi's map has the south at the top, Mappa Mundi has the east at the top. The top of the map is actually east. I'll show you, I might flip it in a minute, just to show you so it's a bit more easy to us. But at the top, you have the Garden of Eden. What is at the centre of this map? Again, just bear in mind, this is a kind of very religious time. In a number one site for many Christians around 1300, it would be Jerusalem. So Jerusalem, in this case, is at the centre of the map. So, where, as I say, it's Mecca in the case of al-Idrisi's map. Now we have Jerusalem. So where is the centre of the world? We have quite a clear viewpoint in both cases. The Islamic perspective, Mecca appears at the centre. The Christian perspective, Jerusalem appears at the centre. And therefore, it's not all about necessarily any kind of scientific accuracy. And after all, as I mentioned in the last class, the world is round. There isn't really a centre anyway. But what we see instead is this representation of ideology that a certain place is seen as particularly important. Now, another feature, only 3 continents were really known to medieval Europe. Europe, Asia, and a little bit of Africa, North Africa. So as a result, this map doesn't include, like our Hadrian's map, sort of Asia and Australia, the Americas. This just shows these 3 continents. Now this is what I meant to say. What we see as well is a few features of here that are kind of like emphasized. So in the top right hand corner, you can see there's this kind of like red pair of fingers. This is meant to represent the Red Sea, which people believe was actually like 2 parts at the time. So the Red Sea actually appears in red. The oceans appear in this kind of like dingy green, kind of browny green colour. The rivers appear in blue. Now, I mentioned before, the Garden of Eden is at the top. That's partly to emphasize the Garden of Eden as a biblically important place in the Bible. But it's also because where does the sun rise in the northern hemisphere? It rises in the east. So for a European, the sun rises in the east, and therefore we put the sun at the top of the map. This is also, by the way, where Christians historically believe the Messiah to come from again. So when they believe that when Jesus returns to the earth, he will come from the east. So again, the east is given priority in this case. Quite different, really, when you think about what I mentioned last class, where much of the modern European view is about emphasizing the Western world, whilst really representing the East quite badly. At this time, actually, in really quite a romanticized way, reflecting a more religious perspective. So the importance of the East, much kind of Christian culture and religion, meant that the East was actually presented very favourably. So it shows really just how much people's viewpoint changes too. But there is also a very ugly element to this map, which is really quite hard to see. You have to zoom in quite a lot. But you might notice there's clearly some little images across the map as well. Like little images, little stories, and some of these images are showing historical events, some are showing biblical events. Some of them are actually very anti-Semitic and reflected sort of a lot of Christian intolerance towards Jewish as well as Muslim people around 1300, but particularly Jewish people in this case. There are some images which are seen as very offensive to Jewish people, showing them sort of worshipping or doing sorts of rituals which they never would have done. Christians basically stereotypes about them. So there are some images, and this is just really reflective of Christian dominance at the time. So yeah, just kind of make the Garden of Eden is right at the top. As I mentioned, Jerusalem is a sort of circle in the centre of the map. So hopefully this reasonably well, but basically this is Jerusalem over here. And you can just see the sort of Christian viewpoint of the world. So if you had to flip the map, so it appears a bit more familiar to the sort of north at the top map, it would look like this. I think it makes it a little bit easier to see. It still doesn't really look like, in many ways, Europe as you might expect it, and certainly not Asia and North Africa. But that is essentially what the map would look like if you instead put east in the east. You can see knowledge was quite limited still. It only goes as far as the Garden of Eden, so essentially it's only going as far as what sort of like a block. So all I'm at the map from a different part of the world. We've got 2 which show largely kind of Middle East centric world. This is a very different one. This is an East Asian map. This is by Kwon-kun and Lee-ho from Korea. This is a Korean map from 1402. And it reflects a very different part of the world because it doesn't really show anywhere like Europe at all. I don't know if anyone wants to again have a go, but if you were to try and name what the countries are, or continents that are 1, 2, 3, and 4, anyone like to go at that?
Ya, siapa yang mau mencoba? Coba itu ada nomor 1, 2, 3, 4 itu negara mana saja. Yang ini kan sebagai center itu Korea, jadi otomatis biasanya. Karena biasanya zaman dulu baru ada orang yang tahu. Jadi tempat-tempat yang banyak dari otomatis lebih. So anyone want to try to answer the question? Silakan Mas.
Number three is Korean country, number two is China country, number four is Japan country, number one is India country.
Is correct?
Yeah, that's right. I was actually trying to remember what one technically was, because I also think it's India, but I've read somewhere some people think it's Africa. I'll double check that in a minute. But you're absolutely right, like, I think it is India. The other two are definitely correct. Two is China, as you rightly say. So this big country in the Korean worldview is China, which makes sense. China's a very big country near to Korea. Three is Korea. Now, what's interesting here, I think, is partly that Korea is actually pretty big on it. In reality, Korea is not very big as a place, but it appears not that much smaller than China. I mean, it's smaller, but it's still pretty significant. So Korea appears quite prominently. And then four, Japan is kind of just like stuck at the edge. Korea and Japan have a long rivalry historically. And China's kind of just, Japan is kind of pushed out the way it is, kind of going out of the map, really, as it doesn't matter all that much. So again, you kind of see certain representations quite interesting here. There's also a few other key features which comes down to sort of your knowledge of these places, which I wouldn't expect everyone to have. But in Korea here, number three, the thing that really appears to me very strong is this kind of orangey brown line along the east coast. You see this quite clear line. And what this is depicting is what's called the Daegu-Daegan mountain range. So in traditional Korean culture, mountains are seen as sacred. They're seen as providing what's called a sort of G energy, kind of linked to Chinese Qi energy. So if you're familiar with sort of traditional Chinese philosophy about energy coming from natural things, Korea has a very similar tradition, which is very much centered on its geography. So mountain ranges are seen as the providers of energy, and for this reason, by the way, Korean cities are built in a very specific way in order to try and maximize its natural energy. Because of this belief in the mountain being really sacred and important, the mountain range is what the cartographers wanted to emphasize to Korea. So the Korean mountains, the Daegu-Daegan, appear as this very, very clear spine, just kind of showing you the significance within traditional Korean culture. By contrast, other things in Korea appear really vaguely. So you think about the coastline. A lot of countries and maps are very careful to depict their coast. Even if I was to like, look at some of the other ones, I'll go back to El but you know, the coastline is quite clear. It's quite easy to see what's land and what's water. In the case of this Korean map, yes, you can see the colour change. The coast is kind of fuzzy. It's actually not that distinct in many places, and a lot of the time you can kind of see it's very rough. It's kind of as drawn as a very smooth line in most places, with little band islands dotted around. But partly again reflects the fact that mountains in Korean culture, the coast doesn't actually matter that much, so the cartographers were much more interested in presenting the mountains than the coast. But yeah, I think you gave a really good answer. I think you can see that China appears very strongly, Korea appears as well. Japan, you identified it correctly in the east. kind of just stuck out of the way. And then in the West, whether we interpret it as India or Africa, either way, it kind of reflects it didn't know very much about it. Kind of thin, narrow, small, and pretty marginal kind of territory, even though both India and Africa are both enormous places. So, trying to create dominate, I just double check that. But I think it actually might be India well. And Europe barely appears at all, again reflecting a lack of knowledge and maybe a lack of interest in Europe. After all, why would a Korean in 1402 be that interested in Europe? Most people wouldn't have been. Okay, so let's come on to the matter of projection too. This is maybe the most well-known projection from math. The Mercator projection, and after its creator. And it has a certain kind of controversial history to it, because even though, because we see it as the main way of presenting the world, it reflects a very biased viewpoint. If you look at it, for example, and if you know how big places in the world are, what you realise is that places near the poles, the North and South Pole, are really big. It really emphasises the size of places like, well, Europe, Russia, Canada, and Greenland. Greenland is truly enormous on the map. Greenland is a big place, but it isn't nearly as big as that. By the way, Australia is roughly the size of the mainland United States, but Australia is tiny. And yet, when you look at the centre, somewhere like Africa, Africa is the second biggest continent on the planet. Africa is an enormous place, and yet it appears quite small. So we see places near the equator are shown as quite small, places near the poles are shown as quite big. And again, why is this? It is a scientific projection, but it reflects a biased viewpoint about a European sort of cartographer trying to make Europe appear bigger than it is. Europe is not a big continent, but Europe on this map appears both near the centre and is pretty large, whereas Africa, which is a far bigger place, is as a quite marginal, small place. So we can see it is like reflective of this idea and notion that Europeans are dominant, that they have greater land. I'm going to show you a video on that in a minute, just to explain it a bit better. But you know, part of the issue here with map making is that, of course, the world is round. And if you have a round world, it's quite hard to make a decent map, because the map is typically flat. It's quite hard to turn a spherical world into a flat map. And so there are a number of different ways of creating maps, a number of different projections. None is perfect, and this is part of the challenge, but some are more biased than others. This is one way you can try and do it, trying to turn the round world into a flat map. This is a different way of viewing it, but the Mercator projection became the dominant version for a good long time. If I can show a video now, I think this is going to convey it even more clearly. So let's just pick that. For people who want to, I have no idea how loud it's going to be in your end, by the way. So if you have headphones in, just
Hi, I'm sorry.
Hello.
Sorry to be late.
No problem.
I'm CJ Craig.
Of course you are. I'm Dr. John Fallow, Dr. Cynthia Sales, and Professor Donald Hugh.
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 Okay. And you are the Organization of Cartographers for Social Equality.
Well, we're from the OCSE. We have many members.
How many?
4,300 dues-paying members.
What are the dues?
$20 a year for the newsletter.
Let's start.
Wait, I want to see this.
This is Josh Lyman.
Indeed you are.
Josh, this is Dr. Fallow, and
Hi.
who's Mary Men. Should we begin?
Yes. Plain and simple. We'd like President Bartlett to aggressively support legislation that would make it mandatory for every public school in America to teach geography using the Peters projection map instead of the traditional Mercator.
Give me $200 and it's done. Really?
No. Why are we changing maps?
Because, CJ, the Mercator projection has fostered European imperialist attitudes for centuries and created an ethnic bias against the Third World.
Really?
The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
It would blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger.
Yes?
Here we have Europe, drawn considerably larger than South America. When it's 6.9 million square miles, South America is almost double the size of Europe's 3.8 million.
Alaska appears 3 times as large as Mexico, when Mexico is larger by 0.1 million square miles.
Germany appears in the middle of the map when it's in the northernmost quarter of the Earth.
Wait. Relative size is one thing, but you're telling me that Germany isn't where we think it is?
Nothing's where you think it is.
Where is it?
I'm glad you asked. The Peters projection.
It has fidelity of axis.
Fidelity of position.
East-west lines are parallel and intersect north-south axes at right angles.
What the hell is that?
It's where you've been living this whole time. Should we continue?
Uh-huh.
So, you're probably wondering what all of this has to do with social equality.
No, I'm wondering where France really is.
Guys, we want to thank you very much for coming in.
Hang on, we're going to finish this.
What do maps have to do with social equality, you ask?
She asked.
Salvatore Natoli of the National Council for Social Studies argues, in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power.
I'm going to check in on Tommy.
Go.
These guys find Brigadoon on that map, you'll call me, right?
Probably not.
Okay.
When third world countries are misrepresented, they're likely to be valued less. Mercator maps exaggerate the importance of Western civilization when the top of the map is given to the Northern Hemisphere and the bottom is given to the Southern. Then people will tend to adopt top and bottom attitudes.
But wait, where else could you put the Northern Hemisphere but on the top?
On the bottom.
How?
Like this.
Yeah, but you can't do that. Yeah, but you can't do that.
Why not?
Because it's freaking me out.
Ada kemungkinan kondisi ini akan semakin
Okay, I like that clip from the West Wing. The West Wing, it's showing really some of the problems that often the case in that highlighted. It does really exaggerate size, especially in places in the poles, particularly of interest to Europeans, for example, considering that Europe is in the north and therefore near the pole. Whilst, as they said, places in the south, including many of the world's poorest countries, are presented much smaller than they really are. So we see it's not just a matter of presenting important places near the centre, it's also a matter of how big. And if you present somewhere as big, it does kind of imply that it's more important, and if you present somewhere as small, it suggests it's not very important. Presenting Africa as very small made later made colonization, or kind of around this time originally actually, but made colonization by European countries seem much more realistic. So we see that there's this kind of imperialistic element to it. So all you need to recognize then is that maps are socially constructed, of course. They might seem neutral, they might seem fair, accurate, but actually, like any social construction, they are subjective. They do reflect our own biases, our own understandings of knowledge, but also what we want other people to believe. So they are socially constructed artifacts. They're not 100% accurate. and they're powerful when they influence how we see the world. If you believe that Africa is small because you see this map of the world and you see that Africa is the same size as Greenland, you might well think, well, Africa doesn't matter that much. And therefore, there's also this power to influence the thinking of other people. If you present this in a school, for example, and that clip is about what maps should they present in American schools, in US schools, children will look at the map and they'll get a very specific vision of the world. You will end up seeing some places as being more important than others. You're not even really being told it. It's just to come to recognize certain places as being more central or significant than others. And that can be quite dangerous. And this is partly where geopolitics comes in. Because we see that maps can be used to make some places appear bigger or smaller, closer or further away, depending on what you're trying to do, depending on what your objectives are. So, by the way, this is what the original Mercator map looks like. It's a bit hard to see. The colours actually kind of all like merge into one, partly how we're seeing it. But it does really show places like Europe appear very large on this map. So, Europe here actually takes up probably a good map, and yet Europe is a very small place. As they mentioned in the video, the map wasn't necessarily intended for any kind of useful purpose. It was largely intended for navigation, to make it easier for sailors to cross the ocean. But because of the way it shows land, it is quite problematic. It does make kind of lands that Europeans knew about appear bigger and more important than other places. As they said as well, Germany's right in the centre of Asia. So, Mercator, the projection of it, just a few other points. It has consistent lines of latitude and longitude. Again, this helps it helps it seem more scientific. It is consistent in that respect. There is a certain kind of mathematical fact based into it. But whilst it does that, it distorts scale and distance. It makes some places appear larger than they are, some places smaller, some places closer than they are, some places farther away. As I mentioned, it's born out of European exploration and trade, so it reflects this European desire for an interconnected world where Europeans were in charge. So it's very Eurocentric in its worldview. And even though it was created in Europe, it was exported in the Age of Empire. So if you lived in any colony of a European power, you would likely you'd likely see this map in your school, for example. And therefore, if you grew up in a colony, you would see this map, and it would again kind of condition you. It would make you think Europeans kind of know what they're doing. They're creating these maps which have scientific accuracy, where Europe appears at the centre, very large. It kind of does imply to you that Europeans are in charge of you. So there is this kind of dangerous element. So they mentioned in the video what map is the best alternative. This is the main rival of the Mercator. There are others, of course, but Arno Peters' projection, which is actually quite young, created in 1973, is the most common alternative to Mercator. And what you see here is a much more accurate view, at least, of the size of places. So suddenly, in this case, Africa is huge, because Africa is huge. It reflects better the actual size of places. South America, as I mentioned in the video, is about twice the size of Europe. And here, South America is big. I mentioned Australia is about the size of the contiguous United States, so basically USA minus Hawaii and Alaska. And this map reflects that. Australia does appear large because it's a very big place. And meanwhile, Europe is actually much smaller than you might be used to if you see the Mercator. I think it's interesting looking at Russia too. Think about Mercator. Yes, Russia is the biggest country in the world, but Russia is pretty enormous on this map. And now it's kind of a bit more realistic. It's still the biggest country, but it doesn't look quite enormous when you have this projection. So a few key features. I would say this is a more equal view of the world. The world in reality may be an unequal place, but the map at least tries to show everywhere equally. It doesn't matter if you're rich or poor, if you're European or African, wherever you might be, where you live is represented much more fairly. Now, any map has to sort of distort something. In this case, it distorts the shape. So the shape of some places doesn't appear quite as you might expect. Though realistically, this is true of any map. The world is round after all, so any place is going to be distorted in its shape. The scale is more consistent, is kind of the crucial feature here. Now, the kind of size of places appears much better. Now, here's a very different map. This feels quite fashionable for making maps like this. I don't know if anyone wants to have a go at working out what this map is actually trying to convey. What is this map actually showing? It isn't all about the shape or size. Something else is representing. Population, thank you so much. Correct. So this is global population. This is showing the size of countries relative to their population size. And suddenly what you notice, of course, is places like India and China getting very large, because China and India have the two largest populations in the world. Look, Indonesia, also appears really large on this map. So it's an alternative viewpoint. This is, again, reflected in scientific data. It's reflected in empirical data, in numbers. Population sizes are as accurate as the people who are counting the population can make them. This map shows that. So it does have a lot of accuracy. But of course it is additionally a distortion. It is kind of warped to reflect population as much as it's representing anything else. So it's kind of another interesting viewpoint, really. So the size of every territory on the map is relative to the proportion of the world's population living there. The bigger your population, the bigger you appear. Suddenly, a relatively small country geographically, like Bangladesh or Nigeria, appear really large because they have big populations. Somewhere like Russia, which is enormous in terms of its area, but its population is relatively modest. Doesn't appear quite so large. And then, of course, there is this question about where to center our worldview. Both maps show Europe in the middle of the map. So Europe and Africa appear at the center. Again, just reflecting this long time assumption amongst Europeans that Europe was the center of the world. So Europe consistently appears sort of in the middle of the map. But that doesn't have to be the case. You can get plenty of other maps which show different places at the center. So this is a map which shows the Americas at the center. And suddenly it looks a little bit weird if you're used to Europe and Africa being at the center. But it's no less kind of accurate or anything like that. It just shows suddenly Europe and Africa appear in the east. Southeast Asia and East Asia appear in the west. Again, really forcing us to rethink what we even mean by west and east. I think what's quite interesting too here is what's the justification? Now you might say, you get a map like this. One of the advantages is the Pacific Ocean, of course, the biggest ocean in the world. And so it kind of makes sense to sort of put it at the margins because then you're not cutting through any major land territory. The problem with this map, of course, is the fact you have to split Asia in half, which makes it a bit awkward to use. You live in somewhere like Kazakhstan or this region, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, this kind of central Asia region, South Asia region, is split. Not very helpful if you're trying to travel one side of the map to the other, but it's still a good representation in terms of depicting somewhere like the Americas. You can get a version like this. Suddenly now the Pacific is put on the stage. And the advantage here, of course, is you're still splitting an ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. You're giving greater attention to places like, well, Indonesia, quite frankly, which now is right in the centre of the map. Now, doesn't Indonesia look more important than it did on the previous map? The other map, Indonesia is kind of stuck out the way, doesn't appear too significant. This map is actually quite favourable. Suddenly Indonesia is like the centre of the world. Sort of see Indonesia as well as places like Thailand, Vietnam, are given kind of a lot more attention because they appear right in the middle, whereas somewhere like Europe is kind of stuck out in the northwest corner. So there are ways in making places seem more important just in your choice of map. You can make places seem give them more attention, depending on what your perspective is. And then finally, like they showed in that video, you can also put the map upside down. And there's nothing wrong with that. Because we learn to think of north being at the top of a map. But there are other ways of depicting things. You look at a map like this, what appears most significant? Well, it's again really somewhere like Australia and Indonesia and Australia, places that are usually presented in the bottom of the map, out the way in the corner, some bottom right corner. Suddenly Australia and Indonesia appear right in the middle of it. And this is kind of much more favourable to the viewpoint of this kind of region. While somewhere like Europe is now just like in the corner, it's kind of easier to forget about. So, I don't know how easy it is to do this here, but I'd be interested to know. I gave you 5 main maps. I'd actually kind of just interested to hear your own views on which one you like the most. Of those 5 maps of the world, which one did you like the most? Did you like Al-Idrisi's map at the beginning? Map of Mundai, the Cater's map, Peter's map, or the map where the Pacific is kind of in the middle?
Menurut kalian di 5 peta yang disampaikan itu kalian prefer ke mana? Apakah satu Al-Idrisi, yang kedua Vektor, or Pacific map? They prefer Pacific map because a lot of them maybe they prefer to like Pacific.
Who likes the Pacific map the most? Number 5.
Siapa yang pilih nomor 5? Silakan katakan. Dan apa namanya? Yang Pacific map itu.
I saw a few kind of hands go like this. I'm going to take that as a hands up. They don't like the Cater's map. Number 3 the most.
Silakan. Nomor 1 berapa orang yang angkat tangan? Coba kita mau survei nih. Prefer mana? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 paling banyak. Nomor 1. Siapa yang prefer nomor 1? Jadi itu lebih ke wilayah Mekah yang menjadi pusat atau center dari tidak ada. Nomor 2, Makamundi. Ini wilayah Yerusalem. Ada Mercator. Nomor 3. Ini salah satunya ada kekurangan yang yaitu di wilayah yang dekat dengan Pola, utara, selatan, yaitu exaggerate, tidak terlalu besar. Sedangkan untuk non-features, ini udah hanya semacam kebaikan. Oke, saya kembali lagi ke nomor 3. Apakah ada yang prefer untuk nomor 3? Karena beda dengan temannya nggak apa-apa. Apa nama kata saja. Nomor 4, features, ada. Dengan nomor 5, Pacific map. Ada. The majority of them.
I was a bit critical of the vacation one, so yeah, I think I wondered how popular the first 2 are actually. I'm quite partial to reading most of them. Okay, so I think what we're seeing is the world can be represented in a number of different ways. There is a certain ideology roots here, and we'll look at this more when we look at the Cold War in the next class. But it's important just to recognize that there isn't just one way of understanding the world. We're often conditioned, we often learn to view the world in a certain way. We learn to see the world in a certain way. We get shown the same kinds of maps, and it does affect how we view places and where we think they are. But in reality, all maps are subjective and socially constructed, and they do contain particular biases. And so it is worthwhile thinking hard about what is the map that you are given actually showing you? Is there anything which is actually hidden away in it? Is there anything the map isn't showing? It's also important. As much as what we see on the map is important, what is the map not showing? What is the map ignoring? Is it causing us? Is it trying to make us forget about places? So this is something also worth bearing in mind. Now, this is of course a class of geopolitics and geostrategy. So for the remainder of this class, I want to show you some examples of how maps have been used to directly shape foreign policy and geostrategy. There are some important examples throughout history, where a map has really changed the world in many ways. So one of the best examples, if not the best, one of my favourites is this. Treaty of Tordesillas, 1494. I don't know if anyone's ever come across this treaty, but I'm going to give you a little bit of background to it. It's one which affected the whole world in some way. It's one which a lot of people did not care about, tried not to care about, but it has affected so much of modern life in really every part of the world. So, a bit of background. What happened in 1492? Christopher Columbus sails to the so-called New World. Even the phrase New World is reflective of the European vibe. What makes the New World new? It's been there just as long as Europe has. It's just Europeans didn't really know that much about it, apart from the family Ericssons when Leif Erikson went there centuries before. But the New World, Columbus ends up in the New World. 1492, his first voyage of 3. A few other just points to mention here. Columbus was doing this on behalf of Spain. Spain at the time was really kind of two places, Aragon and Castile, but we just call it Spain for now. And he was doing it on behalf of Spain after being rejected by Portugal. He actually originally was living in Portugal and asked Portugal to fund him to do this, but they refused and they went to Spain. Columbus was actually Genoa, we believe, in Italy. So he represented Spain, although he wasn't originally from Spain. His aim wasn't actually to go to the New World, because he didn't really know about it. He was aiming to go to India and the Spice Islands, like Indonesia. So he's trying to find Asia, but he thought he would be able to find them by going west. Historically, most Europeans never went west. They thought it was the edge of the world, or were used to going east. Although actually, even by this point, they struggled to get around South Africa. But he wants to find a new route to India and by going westward. And he succeeded because he got there using the trade winds and essentially discovered a continent which Europeans didn't know anything about. What's important? Well, he went back to Spain and I go to the Moluccas actually, so I advise you said the Spice Islands. So he thought he'd play that. Why is it important? Well, he went back to Spain. On the way back to Spain, stopped by Portugal, particularly to both, because, as I said, the Portuguese king had said, no, I'm not funding you. He went to the king and said, by the way, you might like to know, I managed to get to Asia. He thought he was in Asia, right? I think he thought somewhere like, I can't remember which one it was, somewhere like Dominican Republic. Like, he got it wrong. He didn't actually know where he was, but he thought he found Asia by going west. He boasted about it on the 2nd of Portugal. Now, this angered the king of Portugal. Not so much that Columbus had succeeded in doing something that he could have funded for him, but because he said that actually anything west of Europe should be Portuguese. He cited this treaty in 1479, older treaty, which said that anything discovered in the Atlantic to the west of Portugal is the ownership of Portugal. Okay, so hopefully following okay. So Columbus goes to Portugal. Portugal says, actually, those lands that you found are Portuguese now, because this treaty says that anything to the west is Portuguese. Now, what happened then is it stimulates a diplomatic crisis. Spain and Portugal both claim these new lands for themselves. Columbus has found them in the name of Spain, but Portugal say this 1479 treaty means that the lands should be Portuguese. What happens is Spain and Portugal go to the Pope. So Isabella and Ferdinand, the rulers of Spain, they go to the Pope and they say, dear Pope, can you please confirm that these lands are ours? Bearing in mind that in Europe at the time, the Pope was the number one authority. Whatever the Pope did, on the whole, would be most important. The Pope basically agreed with them, just as another bit of background. The Pope was Spanish, so he's probably a bit biased, but he largely agreed, saying that Spain should own these new territories as long as they convert them to Catholicism. So if he had a certain purpose of his own, he thought this was where Catholics But he said that Portugal should, as a compromise, get Africa. So Portugal will get Africa, Spain will get the Americas. Portugal, unsurprisingly, didn't like this because Portugal said that this 1479 treaty was still most important. And so what happened next is Spanish and Portuguese diplomats met in a town near the border between them called Tordesillas. Spanish and Portuguese representatives go to this town and they try and find a new agreement of dividing the world into Spain, Spanish lands, and Portuguese lands. And the treaty they signed is called the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494. What the treaty ended up doing, and this is based on actually what the Pope suggested, is they divided the world into two. So here is a map which basically just depicts what happened. The yellowish line is what the Pope suggested in 1993. So he said we should divide the world north to south. If any new place is discovered to the west of that line, it should belong to Spain. If any new territory is discovered to the east of the land, it should go to Portugal. It divides the world into two. It's incredibly simplistic, a very simple solution, one which doesn't really give any respect to people actually living in these places, but it just says half the world should be Spanish, half the world should be Portuguese. The Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 changed the line a bit. It actually moved it further west. So the final line is that purple one through the centre. That purple line is the result of the treaty. Anything to the west is Spanish, anything to the east is Portuguese. As we'll see, this has had a major impact on modern society, but it's a good kind of early-ish example of geopolitics and geostrategy in a way. We see that two European powers, bilaterally, just the two of them, carve up the world between them. They don't care what other countries think. They don't care what people in all of these territories think. They were just like, you're a bit Spanish, I'm a bit Portuguese, vice versa, and that would be that. And this treaty was kind of largely agreed. There were certain other caveats to it. You had to sail around Africa, you often off the line of it, mentioned that. But it does largely reflect where the Spanish colonies ended up being. Spanish colonies tended to be to the west of the line. Portuguese colonies tended to be to the east of the line. So, a few kind of updates I want to mention on this line. First of all, 1500, so 8 years after Columbus, 6 years after the treaty, Pedro Álvares Cabral, a Portuguese navigator, reaches Brazil for the first time. They didn't know Brazil existed. Portugal didn't know about Brazil until Cabral makes it in 1400. This makes the land Portuguese. This is one of the first examples of a territory being essentially claimed by a country based simply on a map. This map meant that Cabral could claim Brazil Portugal, because this map said so. Because Brazil is, of course, the west, or it's to the east of the line, because he ended up here. So this is where the complication comes in. Over time, Portugal realised that Brazil was much bigger than they expected. When they drew this line, they thought this would go through the sea the entire way. They didn't realise when you got hit that the line actually crosses into South America. So they reached this territory, reached over here somewhere, and claimed it for Portugal east of the line. But later on, the Portuguese went further and further west, and essentially pushed the line further to the west over time. So as Brazil, they found was bigger than they expected, the line was kind of skewed to the west. Now, soon after that, knowing that there's clearly this land in this part of the world, Spanish explorers and conquistadores like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro ended up claiming most of the Americas and Spain as well. So this really explains why most of Latin America, most of South and Central America speak Spanish, because these are places which Spain claimed because of this map. So the map really shows us where can you claim if you're Spain and Portugal. It's a real tool of kind of imperialism in that regard. So, just kind of depicting it as well, just some of the significant elements. The map at the bottom left, this is just a reminder of where the line is. But thinking about language, the languages of the world really do reflect very well the Treaty of Tordesillas. So you have on the left, on the top, Spanish language speakers, where Spanish is the official language, or in the darker orange, or at least widely spoken in the paler orange, what you notice is that almost all of these territories are west of the line. So the map created because of the Treaty of Tordesillas explains why we tend to find Spanish speakers in the Americas. It's because that line, that map, gave Spain sovereignty, as far as they were concerned, over those places. The map at the bottom shows Portuguese places. There aren't as many of them. There are various reasons for that. Partly that Portugal's empire, for most of it, was based on developing trading posts, basically developing port, as opposed to pressing further and further inland. But nevertheless, Portuguese territories are generally on the eastern side. Brazil is the exception, but as I mentioned, because it was east, but they found it was bigger and just pushed the line further west over time. But Angola and Mozambique and Guinea-Bissau and Sao Tome and Principe in Africa, all of these places in Africa, the four main Portuguese, or five actually, for this. What is that one? Yeah, Cabo Verde. Cabo Verde, Guinea-Bissau, Sao Tome and Principe, Angola, Mozambique. All of these are to the east of the line. The five Portuguese territories are all to the east, and then also Timor-Leste over here, again to the east. And of course, the Portuguese were very involved in the Indonesian region, their history as well. And again, it's because of this treaty. It essentially said to Portugal, you're allowed to go and explore these places. Portugal was not doing that. Now, there are a couple of exceptions, of course, as I mentioned. Not just the fact that Brazil kind of crosses the line. The other two have their own history. So one is Equatorial Guinea. Equatorial Guinea in Africa is a Spanish-speaking country. So it is the only territory in Africa where there's a long history of Spanish speakers. Why is that? Africa is to the east. The reason is that Portugal claimed it and then decided it didn't really like it. They found that people would get very sick from disease there, and they just basically said this place is too dangerous and too hard to colonize. So in about 1778, Portugal decided we can't be bothered. We don't want Equatorial Guinea. It's just too difficult to live there. So Spain just took it. The other country is the Philippines. So the Philippines, of course, Southeast Asian country, Spanish-speaking, much of it, long history of Catholicism in the Philippines. And this is where the country kind of broke the treaty. Portugal meant to essentially claim it, but Spain took it, and then after a little bit of an argument, decided between them, actually, okay, Spain, the Philippines is all yours. And they didn't really care what local people thought. They just divided it amongst themselves in that respect.
Ask you.
Yeah.
Okay, then to be finished up this, what about Macau and also Goa in India?
Yeah, so likewise, Macau and Goa, both Portuguese territories for a long, long time, both because they're east of the Tordesillas line. So because they're in the Indian Ocean, they're east of the line, Portugal felt that they could claim them. And, they're both ports. Portuguese were largely keen on just claiming trading ports throughout most of their imperial history. The Portuguese were also very involved in some of the cities around Yemen, Mozambique, different parts of East Africa. These were just places east of the line which Portuguese sailors would go to on the way to India and Indonesia. They would Portuguese would typically start in Portugal, and they kind of like wind around the main ports around South Africa. Cape of Good Hope in South Africa is so named kind of optimistically because it was incredibly dangerous to sail around. There was a big deal when Vasco da Gama, the Portuguese navigator, finally made it round. And they would sort of just follow it around to Mozambique, around like Kenya, Tanzania, Somalia, Yemen, and just Bahrain, I believe, as well. And we just kind of continue to follow it to Goa, which is around here in India, and then from there they kind of go around the Malacca Strait, and eventually would make it to Macau in China. So essentially that's why. But it doesn't show everywhere, it shows kind of like the main states, opposed to autonomous places. Okay, but there's also a problem. I don't know if anyone can see the problem. And the reason why there's a problem is because the world is round. So if you draw a line splitting the world into two, what happens when you get to the other side of the world? If the West is Spanish, the East is Portuguese, you go around the world, where does West begin? Where does East end? You see, there's an issue. This became an issue after Ferdinand Magellan travels westwards around the world. So, what happens here? This is another interesting area of actual geopolitics. Again, did it to Spain, but he wasn't Spanish, he was Portuguese. But even though he was Portuguese, he represented Spain because Portuguese didn't want him to do this. The Portuguese king at the time didn't like him. So he travelled on behalf of Spain. So he has permission to go west through Spanish territory, of course. He goes west through the Atlantic, makes it to the Americas, and then he goes all the way into South America. So, he goes all the way to South America, and then he gets around here. This is called the Straits of Magellan, named after him. So he would get here, and then from here, he headed towards Southeast Asia. He, by the way, again, no one had an idea. No European had a clue about the Pacific Ocean. He expected to get across the Pacific in, I think, a matter of days. It took him, it took him so long to get across the Pacific Ocean because he didn't realize how big it was. But finally, Magellan, on behalf of Spain, makes it eventually as far as the Philippines. Partly, again, explaining why the Philippines is speaking territory. He was killed in 1521 in the Philippines. He was partly trying to convert people to Catholicism, and not everyone liked that, so he was killed. His colleague, Juan Sebastian Elcano, then completes the journey. So Magellan and Elcano between them become the first people to go across the entire world. Well, he's Elcano, but he's often credited with it. Figure. I can't explain that necessarily. It's because he was in charge for the first part of the trip. But Elcano finishes the journey, makes it all the way back to Spain via the Spice Islands of the Moluccas. What this shows is the world is round. This proves that the world is round. You can go west all the way around back to your home. But the problem here was, where was west and where was east? If you can go around the entire world, it's kind of now hard to define where the line is. You need a second line. You need a new line dividing the rest of the planet. So the issue at the time was that both Spain and Portugal claimed the Moluccas, so the Spice Islands, the most valuable territory to Europeans. Spices were so expensive and valuable that Europeans always wanted to claim the Spice Islands of the Moluccas. Spain and Portugal both said they should be there. Portugal said, if you go east, you can get there, so they're Portuguese. Spain now says, if you go west, you can get there, so they should be Spanish. So what happened is they had to sign a new treaty, which is the Treaty of Zaragoza of 1529. This treaty took 5 years of negotiations, by the way, just showing how difficult it was and how important it was. 5 years to come up with this treaty. There's this famous story, which is possibly like an urban myth, not actually true, but that whilst the negotiations were going on, this small boy sees the negotiators walking down the street. He pulls down his trousers, shows them his backside, and says, hey, I've got an answer to your problem. Draw the line across my bottom. That would be the way to do it. Joy, maybe not. But what happened then is a new line had to be defined. This is the outcome. And again, you can sort of see where the territory that the later claimed fall. So the Treaty of the Tordesillas here, I mentioned before, you can see the Americas largely go to Spain. Africa, the Indian Ocean region, including much of South and Southeast Asia, goes to Portugal. And then you've got this new line which goes in the east, kind of east of Japan and through Australia, which again, they didn't know about at the time. And it meant that finally, you could divide the world into two parts, Spanish parts and Portuguese parts. Interestingly, and in a reflection of modern geopolitical relations and international studies, both countries claimed that they were hard done by. Both claimed that the other country got a better deal and were angry about it. I think in reality, Portugal got slightly more than the US. In a way, Portugal was a bit better from it. But it just goes to really show, I think, some of the kind of challenges involved in claiming territory. Now, there are some other outcomes which I'm going to come on to in a minute, but remember the key point here. A map is used to define and justify who should own the world. What bits of the world should be Spanish, what bits should be Portuguese, all based on the drawing of a map. Now, this is a map from the time, a map from the time. The same year as the Treaty of Zaragoza by Ribeiro. What's really interesting about this map is where it puts the Moluccas. As I say, this region was the most valuable part of the world to Europeans. Ribeiro kind of like hedges his bet. He essentially comes up with a kind of compromise in that he puts it on either side of the map. So for a Spanish viewer, they're happy because it shows on the west. For a Portuguese viewer, they're happy because it shows it in the east. So the Moluccas are put on both sides of the map, reflecting the fact that both Spain and Portugal claim them for themselves. It's quite a sort of a way of compromising too. But there are some other important outcomes. First of all, thinking a bit about the history of the world. What happened to indigenous civilizations like the Maya and the Incas in the Americas? They were both conquered by Spain. Spain said, this is our territory. They didn't like people who refused to convert to Catholicism, so they wiped them out. So the Aztecs, by the way, had already been collapsed by this point. But the Maya and the Incas were conquered by Spain. And this really just led to the end of them. So to those groups, really damaging the treaty. Now, of course, other European nations didn't agree with this treaty either, because they said, why should Spain and Portugal get all the colony? What about us? So, as England, the Netherlands, and France gradually became bigger, and eventually, certainly in the case of, well, arguably all of them, more powerful than Spain and Portugal, they decided to just reject the treaties and would break it. If you know about pirates, the reason we had pirates at the top was because of the Treaty of Tordesillas. Pirates were people who were commissioned, essentially, to steal, in the first place, Spanish and Portuguese ships. So, like, the English government would create sort of paperwork to fund English sailors to go and raid Spanish boats in the Atlantic Ocean. So, piracy becomes an issue as well. It's also the rise of concepts like the freedom of the sea. If you think about the seas, who owns the sea? This becomes an issue partly because of this treaty as well. So, the Dutch sort of legal scholar Hugo Grotius comes up with this concept of freedom of the seas to say that the treaty has no legitimacy. The treaty is wrong because actually no one can claim the sea, and really, he didn't really like the idea of people claiming territory in this way. So what we see from this point is also argument about who should claim the seas. In terms of contemporary disputes, there are also examples which link back to the Treaty of Tordesillas and that map. I don't know if you're familiar with what are either called the Falkland Islands if you're British, or the Malvinas if you're Argentinian. But this is a small island range off the coast of Argentina, and has long been the site of conflict. It had war in the 80s, in 1982. But it's sort of disputed island territory between the UK and Argentina. So the UK currently claims it as an overseas territory. I think most of the international community sees it as British for the meantime. But Argentina, what we said, we have just as much right, if not more. A, we're much nearer. And B, Argentina claims that because it is the descendant of Spain, because Argentina gained its independence from Spain, it therefore has the right of the Treaty of Tordesillas to claim this territory as its own. So Argentina uses the treaty to say the Malvinas Islands are Argentinian. That's what the treaty says. Incidentally, Chile, which claims, Antarctica is kind of like unofficially claimed by a few nations. Chile's claims to Antarctica is rooted in the same idea that part of Antarctica, being west of the Tordesillas line, should be Chilean because they are descendants of Spain. Okay, I'm going to mention another case study now, and again just shows the power of maps. This time is about the British Empire. So, the British Empire claimed somewhere between a quarter and a third of the world at its highest point, and which famously, at least in Britain, used pink as its colour. So in British imperial maps, pink was the colour used as British territory. What you see on this map is a good example. This is a famous Imperial Federation map from 1886, and it shows a few key features that we've discussed today. First of all, it uses the Mercator projection, classic imperial projection, which shows Europe is big and Africa is small. So this is a way of saying Britain is bigger than it actually is. It's a big place in reality, and Africa becomes more. It looks a bit easier to claim. It also, though, because Canada is part of the British Empire, Canada is big. That also seems quite large. But crucially, Britain is quite near the centre. In reality, Britain's very far north. Northern part of Britain isn't that much further away from the North Pole as parts of Antarctica are from the South Pole of Europe. So Britain is very far north, but it appears quite central. Just to show the British colonies, so you can see places like South Africa, India, Australia, Canada, all appear quite clearly. And what's also interesting is this use of stereotyping. They're stereotyping different places. And this is done through the use of animals especially. So the animals are used decoratively to symbolize the main British colonies. So India is depicted as an elephant. You might see around the edge, there is an elephant in the kind of bottom left. That is shown as representation of India. Australia is shown as a kangaroo and a sheep. So you see this use of sort of animals to stereotype what British people thought of their colonies. So similarly, a bit later on, the British published this, the British Empire Marketing Board around 1927. Again, you see the use of this pink shade to claim British territories. You can see there's been a bit of an expansion in Africa by this point. And what's right at the centre of the map, it's not Mercator projection, but Britain is still at the centre. So Britain appears at the centre of the world. That is essentially the message it's trying to convey. Britain is the most important place, centre of the planet, therefore centre of the map. And then around it, you see other key colonies. Suddenly, actually, what's interesting, I think, a lot of the colonies became much closer together. So Britain to India or Canada, they don't look very far apart, not very far apart. But it makes it look more realistic why Britain is kind of claiming these areas. And then this brings me to the matter of India. So India also has a very important and interesting history when it comes to use of mapping, because that's kind of a major part of its independence story. So again, a bit of context. India was seen as like the jewel in the British Empire's crown. It was seen as the most important and valuable colony for Britain. Britain loved India. It's where it got spices, got a huge amount of wealth from it. So there's a story as well that Queen Victoria received India. She was made Empress of India on her birthday. So it's seen as like a really great birthday present, basically. So India was seen as this great pride and joy for Britain. But eventually, like other colonies, it had to get its independence. So this is where mapping comes in. Just as again, a little bit of background to what's going on. Of course, for decades, there had been plenty of independence pressure in India. The most famous thing is Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent civil resistance and protests against British rule. The British also didn't really understand the religious details of India. They weren't very good at kind of recognizing, especially Hindu and Muslim beliefs. There's a famous case of a mutiny, which was based on the fact that the British army expected Muslim and Hindu soldiers to fight into a capsule containing the bullet. The capsule was the cartridge was made of a kind of mixture of beef and pork fat, which of course neither Hindus nor Muslims would want to fight into for religious reasons. The British didn't really understand that. Anyway, lots of independence pressure. World War II, of course, takes place. World War II is incredibly expensive for Britain, and it eventually realizes it can't afford to run India anymore, so it kind of reluctantly accepts it will have to become independent. But around the same time, there's this new movement in India to create a second country, that instead of just making India one independent nation, there should be a second nation for Muslims. That basically, because there are more Hindus than Muslims in India, in a democratic system, Hindus would always be in the majority, and what about how would Muslims have a vote that actually mattered? This becomes the basis of a movement to create Pakistan. The Pakistan as a Muslim majority country. The challenge here is, where do you draw the line? Well, maps were used for this purpose, of course. So what happened is the Viceroy, Mountbatten, who had been working in Burma as well in India, but just over the border, he is put in charge of creating an independent India and an independent Pakistan. He employs a lawyer called Cyril Radcliffe, who is from Britain. He had never famously been east from Paris. He had no idea about anything that to do with India. He was very ignorant about India, which it seems maybe part of the point, because he was seen as being unbiased and neutral, because he'd never been there. What Radcliffe did to create this new border was he took census data. He looked at what areas of India had mostly Muslim people and what areas had mostly Hindu people, and he basically drew a line between them. He also looked at things like transport infrastructure and rivers, but he used all of these things, especially religious data, to define where this border would be. Unfortunately, the data was actually out of date, which could have been a problem, or that later maybe. So the result was, he comes up with this border. Now, I don't know if anyone can see the problem with the border, the target problem in there, but this is the map, and the red lines are the partition line. So India and Pakistan as two independent nations. There's a quite clear issue with it. Do you see the issue? Yeah. Hindu majority India, Muslim majority Pakistan. But Pakistan especially is a little bit hard to manage.
Ini silakan berpendapat bagaimana sejarah atau histori mengenai delimitasi batas daratan antara India dan juga Pakistan dan Bangladesh berdasarkan religious. Kalau di India, the majority of them they are Hindu, and Pakistan Bangladesh. So menurut kalian bagaimana caranya mendelimitasi batas antara India dan Pakistan? Ada yang mau berpendapat sih? Itu udah pernah saya bahas di kelas. Ya, silakan ada yang mau berpendapat. Waktu kita tinggal 20 menit lagi. Silakan. Masih diikut mau berpendapat silakan.
I think the partition is by the religion. Some part are Muslim like Pakistan and East Pakistan and now called Bangladesh, and the rest are Hindu majority in India.
Yeah, absolutely, that's what happened, and you're right. I'm really glad you answered, you pointed out East Pakistan, because this was a big part of the issue. What you see is that Pakistan was basically two places. Pakistan was divided into two. It's quite hard for, especially a new government, to manage somewhere which is like 1,000 miles away. So they had two Pakistans, basically Pakistan and East Pakistan. As you say, both Muslim majority societies, they were both designed to be Muslim states, whereas India was designed as a secular state, technically, but with a Hindu majority. And modern day Indian politics become more conservative Hindu focused. But the issue really here is that how do you manage a country which is so divided? You know, if you were to try and get from one bit of Pakistan to the other, you have to go through hundreds of miles of India to make it. And this was a major issue. It's partly why Bangladesh later gained independence as a factor in. Bangladesh is what East Pakistan once was, another Muslim majority society, but because of the impracticalities of this line. So the line was quite a problem, really. There were some other major issues though, the most noteworthy of which is what happened in the immediate aftermath of the partition. The two countries gained their independence. The British actually don't announce their independence, or so they don't announce the line until they're independent and the British Army and security forces left. So the British get out of the area, and then they say, by the way, this is where the border is. And then this leads to massive panic as a huge number of people, millions of people, try to cross into the country that they think they should live in. So a lot of Hindu people move from Pakistan to India, a lot of Muslim people move from India to Pakistan. A huge amount of violence takes place, it's chaotic, it's a kind of one of the great tragedies of the 20th century because so much fighting took place during it. And it's partly because of this mismanagement that it was announced very late and as a bit of a shock. And it's partly because of the security forces to kind of manage the situation. There are a few other quirks, a few other issues which would transpire and help explain some of India and Pakistan's often tense geopolitical relationship. One of these is to do especially with some of the northern parts of the area. Basically, what happened is you had essentially the choice of which place to live in within reason. And the line was, as I say, based upon religious data usually, so Hindu areas on one side, Muslim areas on the other. There are some problems because some places are very diverse, quite hard to divide. But there were a few territories called princely ruled territories, where essentially the local leader had the choice. So instead of it being based on the population, it was based on what one man thought. And a lot of these princes chose to be in India, but their populations were largely Muslim. You have a Hindu leader of a Muslim area, and these territories have tended to be the most contested since, because they're part of India, according to the ruler, but most of the population wants to be part of Pakistan. The map on the right is a map of Pakistan, according to Pakistan. What you might notice if you look carefully is they both claim the same territory in the north. So there's this one part around Kashmir, which both India and Pakistan, as well as China, eventually, and parts of it, an area called Aksai Chin, all claim as their own. So this is again where maps are quite problematic. If you get an Indian map of India, it shows this northern part is India. If you get a map of Pakistan in Pakistan, it shows the very same area as Pakistan. They both claim the same thing. If you were to go on Google Maps right now and look it up, it actually, I think, depends on where you are in the world. So I think they change it based on where you're searching from. But most maps show it as a kind of fuzzy line. No one's really entirely sure where the border is, partly because of that history. And they're very contested. It's an area which both India and Pakistan claim. And no surprises, this is an area that's seen quite a lot of conflict ever since India's and Pakistan's independence. Bottom map then, how Pakistan sees India. This is kind of like one representation of it. And again, you see, it only shows this very narrow strip as being part of India here. So a Pakistan map of India just shows this tiny little bit of India, whereas a map in India shows this bit as being India as well. So you can see, maps are quite powerful. in affecting how we view the world. If you were at an Indian school, you're going to believe that some place in part of India, which someone in a Pakistani school could disagree with you about. So maps, do reflect their creators. There's another good example of this. There are quite a few good examples, but a very tiny one is also Israel and Palestine. So their story, there are some big differences, of course, from India and Pakistan, but there are also a few major similarities. Both of them, to a start, were both kind of created out of partition. Both of them had the British put in charge of them as well. So I can't talk through the whole thing. It's going to take probably, 10 weeks to talk through this entire issue because it's so complex. But if I just have to mention a few things today. Essentially, 1920, the League of Nations, which was like the precursor, it was like the first version of the United Nations, established after World War I, gave Britain responsibility for this area of what was once the Ottoman Empire. So it gave it responsibility for the territories of Palestine and Transjordan, and it also defined the border. Now, British Admiral Balfour had previously said there should be a Jewish state in this area, largely because of the amount of discrimination Jewish people were facing in Europe. He said, there should be a safe homeland for them, where most Jewish people once kind of came from, and kind of drawing their origin back to this territory, ever since the Romans had pushed most people out. So Britain was put in charge of creating a Jewish state as well, and that would exist alongside an Arab state on the Palestine side of the border. So you can see the sort of pale yellow. This is the Palestine area of the British Mandate after World War I. Palestine at the time, by the way, was largely used by Jewish settlers. So the phrase Palestine is now very closely associated with Arab Muslims, but actually for a few decades, it was largely seen as a Jewish kind of phrase, interestingly. So there were various attempts to draw a line. The Peel Commission in 1937, for example, tried to create a new border. They never kind of worked out. There had been various protests against the idea of building a Jewish state across the world. And then British rule ended in 1948 when Israel gained its independence. So Israel becomes a state in 1948. And what this leads to is a huge amount of conflict in the area. There's a lot of pushback against it. Various wars, of course, have been fought here. And even to this day, what this means is you see, again, very different maps of the region depending on who's talking. So the map on the left, I would say, is maybe the most nuanced map you're going to get. It shows Israel, but it also quite clearly depicts places like the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan, which are the three most contentious territories, all of which are claimed by other groups as well. So West Bank and Gaza as the Palestinian authorities, and Golan as a territory historically, as in particular with Syria, they do appear on the map. But instead, what you will often see in this part of the world are these other two maps. So in the center, we have a fairly standard Israeli map of Israel. What you'll see is Israel appears much bigger than other maps. So somewhere like the West Bank actually doesn't really appear very clearly. There's a faint label, but it doesn't appear as a separate area. Then on the right, you have a very kind of typical Palestinian sort of map of the area, which it doesn't technically have it does have labels, but it doesn't really put on. But you'll see that on this map, it doesn't even mention Israel. So Israel is completely ignored from that, and instead it talks about places like, it mentions Palestine in terms of ports, it mentions Gaza in terms of airport, but it completely ignores Israel. So Israel and Palestine, depending on who's doing the talking, show the map very differently as well. So it's another way in which maps are really used to reflect particular perspectives. Perfect. So the final case study I'm going to show you today is this one, which is maybe the most unusual. I'm not sure how many of you will have come across this place. It's not very famous, but it's very interesting. It's called Bir Terrell, and it is in the Sahara Desert. It's on the border between Egypt and Sudan, and what's weird about it is neither country wants it. So I've done a lot of talking today about powerful countries trying to claim territory as their own through the use of maps. This is like the opposite. This is where a map is used to say, this is a territory we don't want. A country not wants a territory which it has a legitimate claim to. Again, it's based on maps. So, what happened is, at the time, Britain and Egypt had been squabbling a lot about who should own or control this part of the world. In 1899, UK and Egypt signed a treaty which said that the land south of the 22nd parallel would be run jointly as Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. This later meant it would be the border between Egypt and Sudan, as far as they were concerned. So, what you see on this map is a straight line going west to east. This is the border that the British and the Egyptians signed in 1899. However, 3 years later, in 1902, the UK actually decided to change it into a new border, or boundary at the time, recognised, kind of unusually from the British actually, kind of like recognising the needs of local communities. They didn't always do, they tended to like to draw straight lines. But they drew a new boundary because two of the indigenous groups, the main indigenous group, a largely nomadic group called the Ababda people of the Basazuka area, would be to the north, and the Beja people of the Halaib would be to the south. So what this meant is the British changed this straight line into a sort of squiggly line, so that you would have one ethnic group to the north and another ethnic group to the south. It's a way of separating them. Now, what happens next is 1956, Sudan gets its independence, and Egypt and Sudan, to this day, don't agree where their border is. And that's because of these two lines. Basically, Egypt says that the 1899 line is the border. Sudan says that the 1902 line is the border. Why would they disagree? It's because of this area on the coast of the Red Sea called the Halaib Triangle. What we see with this territory is it's much more valuable. It's on the coast, it's more fertile, it's much easier to live. Both countries want Halaib. However, if you were to claim Bir Tawil on the east, which also falls between the squiggly and the straight line, if you claim Bir Tawil, it implies that you don't claim Halaib. You can only claim one of the two. If you choose the squiggly line, you get one place but not the other. If you choose a straight line, you get one place but not the other. You can't have both. You can't take Bir Tawil and Halaib. Both countries want Halaib more than Bir Tawil, and therefore Bir Tawil is this unusual situation where you have a land between two countries that neither country claims. So neither of them want it, and what makes this even a weirder situation is in the past decade or so, various people on the internet have said, if they don't want it, I'll take it myself. So I'll mention those people in a minute. But yeah, the Halaib is more fertile and coastal, so they both want it. Claiming Bir Tawil means giving Halaib to the other. I'm going to show you a quick video explaining this a bit further. It's a bit silly just for you. A bit British actually. Again.
Look at the map. We're the men, and here's the map. Today's map is of the disputed border between Egypt and Sudan. In particular, this bit here called Bir Tawil, a bit of land the size of London which nobody wants. As with many badly drawn borders, it starts with the British.
So we'll draw a line here in the middle of the desert, ignoring all tribal boundaries, because we own this place anyway, so I don't really see it being a problem. Can I please have a sandwich?
It turns out the British got very good at drawing straight lines, seemingly unaware of all the trouble they were to cause. But once a line's been drawn, that's final, right?
Unright. 3 years later, in 1902, the British drew a new line to better reflect cultural differences.
We should never have drawn that straight line. I can assure you the man who drew that line has been shamed.
So now there were 2 borders, a straight one and a squiggly one.
And here came the problem. This area, known as the Halaib Triangle, was valuable, and both sides wanted to control it. So Egypt claimed the straight line,
And Sudan claimed the squiggly line. Side effect, if either side claimed beer to will, they'd have to give up the Halib triangle.
it remains the only disputed territory in the world where both sides insist it's not theirs.
So we could just go and claim it.
Technically, yes.
In 2014, an American named Jeremiah Heaton travelled to Beardsville and claimed it for himself so that his 7-year-old daughter could fulfill her dream of being a real princess.
Ain't nothing more important than my daughter's happiness. Now she's got everything she ever wanted. Isn't that right, Sugar Plum?
So, due to the value of the Halaib Triangle, beer to will with literally nothing in it is internationally recognised as terra nullius.
And although many people have tried to claim it, including worryingly Google, the lack of UN recognition,
Or indeed any kind of recognition from anybody,
has left these claims as hollow as this globe. Goodbye.
Okay, so very unusual situation. And again, it's just the use of maths in a way causing a bit of chaos. As they mentioned in the video, so Jeremiah Heaton's one who got the most attention. This American man who anointed himself king of what he called North Sudan, so that he could make his 7-year-old daughter a real-life princess on her birthday. I don't believe the other children got as good birthday presents. But need to look into that more. There have been other people. One Russian man, for example, claimed it for himself. But another high-profile example is this man on the right, Shakespeare from India. He visited, like Eaton visited it, or claims to have visited it. It's quite hard to prove because it's a very small area in a remote desert, so it's not very easy to get to. But there's no border, of course. You can't see anything there. But he claims he's the king of Dixit, named it after himself, and he planted some sunflower seeds to make the claim even more official. So there's some kind of interesting stories about people claiming this land for themselves, because nobody officially claims it. So, just to conclude there, the power of maps. I think what we've hopefully seen is they do have quite a lot of power, maybe surprising amount of power. They both reflect and influence our views of other people and places. So what we're seeing really is a lot of geostrategy is based upon what a map says, or controlling maps and publishing maps to reflect what you think the world looks like. So these representations influence political and geopolitical action. How you can perceive the world, how you treat it, what you think it is, are based upon maps in many ways. If it comes to like a border dispute, such as between India and Pakistan, Israel and Palestine, maps are very powerful in shaping how people there and internationally understand these places. And we can see that at the moment, in a high-profile way with Israel and Palestine, and a huge amount of discussion about whether there should be a two-state solution, which map you use to define a two-state solution. We see a lot of questions about legitimacy and legitimate ownership. We saw with the Treaty of Tordesillas that a map can be used to claim territory that you don't even really know about until you get there. The maps have been very important in defining a lot of international relations, politics, geopolitics. And finally, it really shows us the need to really critically scrutinize and analyze maps and their production and their distribution or dissemination. We have to think very carefully about who is actually producing the map. No map is value-free. No map is neutral. Every map has some sort of power embedded within it. So we have to really think carefully about the maps we're given and what they're trying to tell us, and whether there's actually a bias which is potentially quite dangerous here. So that's everything to me. I think. Thank you so much. There's a question.
So this is the end of the second session. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Answer one question for you. Can you go back on the border in India? So talking about the border between India and China, especially India, like in the province or the states of Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, and Maxim. So the location is quite direct, right? Matter of Himalayan mountain. So there are four processes into the whole two countries that they have a border, share the border. The first is ratification, the limitation, agreement. So how China and India, they ratify and market the border in the area that difficult.
Yeah, and I should have mentioned that important part of it, that it's like the edge of the tallest mountain range in the world. So most people don't really walk around very easily. It's not really easy to navigate. I know that they've created a line of control, they call it, as a sort of boundary. I don't think it's good for official management of it. I don't think it's anywhere that you can easily find in terms of certainly not official, for example, it's impossible. It's I think more of a sort of for some major mountains provide an obstacle which acts as a kind of boundary and prevents movement of people. But it's not as if you can easily put up any kind of issue sense just because the mountains are too difficult. That kind of answer.
Any more questions?
I have two questions. The first question, how has the historical manipulation of cartography been employed as a tool for ideological control, influencing and shaping the worldview of society? And what role has it played in the perception of territorial rights by different powers throughout history? And then, second question, the English territory is so vast that even now English is the dominant language in the world. So why in the 16th century was the world dominated by the Spanish Empire and Portuguese Empire? Thank you.
So the second question is mostly about the conflict, which is
Yes.
and
That's about language. The second one about language, so why English is
Yes.
And sorry, can you remind me of
questions? First question, pertanyaan pertama. Disingkat itu pertanyaan.
I can answer the language. I can try and answer the language of the person to get to make sure I'm completely understanding the first one. So the second one, I would say say English. Why is it more of the global language? I think there's a few factors. I think a lot of it does come to imperialism, but eventually Spain was kind of overtaken by other countries. I would say the USA is probably the main factor here. The USA becoming a superpower with English as its first language has made English the first language because of the USA, probably more than the UK really. I think the UK helped make English widespread in somewhere like India. So a lot of Indian people speak English now because of the imperial history. But I would say in terms of the international sense, it's because the USA is the most powerful economic as well as military world. Because most Americans speak English as their first language, that's why English is now a global language. I would say it's because of the USA being the most powerful. Although interestingly, the USA doesn't have an official language, which is also quite intriguing. I think a lot of people expect Spanish to the USA, but they don't have one. You get a lot of Americans who speak Spanish, but yeah, USA, biggest, most powerful country in the world, makes English the language, I would say.
Okay, add something. In case of British Raj or Myanmar, this is also the colonized by the. But then, in case of this country, this is because in Myanmar, the majority of them they don't speak their differences. So why this is different?
I don't know about that. Actually, that's interesting. I confess I don't know why most people. I don't know how many people in Myanmar speak English, so it's not something that's familiar to me. I know that it was given greater autonomy and sort of form of independence. I think earlier, partly because just disputes, I want to say, and it was a way of trying to stop Indians from protesting against British rule by making Myanmar independent. If I remember correctly. But I'll look it up. It's a good question. I don't know why. I'm for that.
Okay, for the first question, you can repeat again, Mas. Ini apa nomor dua di bahasa Indonesia saja? Oke, silakan. Ini apa?
You want to sit down? Go sit down. I just can't remember the question was. I never really comprehend.
Peta di dunia itu dibuat untuk kepentingan negara di Eropa.
The reasons why he meant by the European, and this is close related to the colonialism or maybe in the past, European think that they are superior than other region across the world. So that is also the part of our.
Yeah, I completely agree with the point. I may be misunderstanding the question, but yes, I think we can see that the maps were part of soft power. I think soft power is a really good phrase to use, that it's not about military might in this case. Yes, Europeans had much history superior weapons to many other parts of the world, which helps explain why European countries were so effective at colonizing different places. But there was definitely this sort of soft power element as well about trying to influence places by publishing maps, presenting Europe as somehow superior or bigger than it was, or in a way that could justify colonial laws. I mean, there's various ways in which European powers would try and claim territory. Part of it was religious as well, I should say. A lot of the time it was about trying to fulfill sort of religious mission to convert people to Christianity. Certainly the British and Spanish and Portuguese were very keen on this at different points of history. But the map certainly was a way of trying to reflect and reinforce what they saw as a form of European superiority, a way of almost trying to make it seem natural and normal.
Ya, oke. So jadi Eropa zaman dulu itu istilahnya mereka itu beranggapan bahwa Eropa itu pusat dunia. Jadi dengan soft politik ya istilahnya. Ini sebetulnya kolonialisme itu dia apa namanya karena ada kemajuan teknologi dan kapal itu ya dia ada gold glory dan gospel yang menyebarkan dan juga berdatang ke tempat-tempat lain yang belum pernah dijelajahi. Jadi dengan alasan peta dunia itu kan dulu awal-awalnya itu kan memang senternya itu di tempat-tempat yang banyak dilayani. Tapi untuk tempat-tempat yang masih jarang penduduk, jarang dijangkau, otomatis masih kurang. Kaitan dengan power dynamism ya. Jadi kalau kita berbicara tentang Eropa, itu di sana pun juga di internal Eropa sendiri kadang ada semacam up and downs. Jadi related to each kingdom. Jadi kadang ada masa kejayaan. Sama seperti mungkin kalau kita berbicara mengenai Hungary kan dulu Austro-Hungaria dan juga wilayahnya cukup masakan sweeping dan itu juga berlaku di Spanish War dan juga Portugis dan juga namanya British. Gue bisa menjawab.
I think you can see just the power of education in a sense. I mentioned if you were at school, what maps need to cover all the schools. I don't know what it will look like all the time here, but in most schools, in my experience, you'll find there'll be maps of walls that in geography classroom, and the way of just really shaping young people's perspectives, often without really realizing it. If you grow up seeing maps looking a certain way, you end up sort of viewing the world in a certain way as well.
Okay, I think this is the end of the first and also the thank you so much for coming, all students. I hope you gain I also being today. And we also invite you today at 8 and you welcome. And thank you and good afternoon. We'll take pictures with Dr. Max.
Dari sini ada sesi untuk yang ada di belakang, silakan melaporkan lagi.
Family trip, badan harus fit. Saatnya jaga daya tahan tubuh, saatnya buat kita.
Look, there.
Dear you,